The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from Sub-China. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Morning.
Cobus, over the past few weeks, we've had a discussion going on both on the podcast, but also I've had the pleasure of hosting a webinar with our friends at the Africa-China Reporting Project talking about misinformation and the info pandemic that's going on right now in Africa related to COVID-19 information. It's been a really big problem that lots of fake news, misleading news, just news that lacks context has been promulgated throughout the social media ecosystem. It's also interesting because it comes at a time when fake news is a framing that has been popularized by U.S. President Donald Trump and is now part of the everyday vernacular, but also something that we've become very skeptical about in terms of the quality of the information we get because of what happened in the 2016 election and everything that we know about what the Russians did. But we've never really looked at Chinese and Russian information, misinformation, fake news, whatever you want to call it, in an African context. And that today is going to be something very interesting that we'll explore.
Yes, we kind of in the past we've talked a lot about the ways that China kind of shapes its messaging in Africa frequently through state-owned media channels. So one would see something like the tabloid Global Times pushing very strident, very kind of nationalist conspiracy theories about U.S. attacks on China or U.S. kind of plots against China, and kind of putting those stories in African media, but and frequently in what we see now from people like the Secretary Pompeo is, the conflation of the two, talking about Chinese and Russian misinformation in Africa. And there certainly is a lot of Chinese information and a lot of Russian information flowing into Africa, but the two are frequently quite different.
And then there's another part of this story, which we're not going to delve into today, but something that we covered in our newsletter is about the role of U.S. information or misinformation, talking about Chinese debt trap diplomacy. And this is all coming out of state-run media. Again, a lot of back and forth between the U.S. and Chinese with Africa caught in the middle. But let's focus today on China and Russia in particular. And for that, we've got two excellent guests who are really focusing on these issues. Dzvinka Kachur is a researcher at the Center for Complex Systems in Transitions at Stellenbosch University in Cape Town. And Jean Le Roux is a research associate with the Digital Forensics Research Lab, which is a department within the Atlantic Council think tank in Washington. He joins us also from Cape Town. Dzvinka and John, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for the invitation.
It's great to have you on. This is an area that, again, we haven't really talked much about on the show. At the same time, there's not a lot of exploration about Chinese and Russian information strategies in Africa. Let's start with what's going on from where you are in your neighborhood in South Africa, and then we'll kind of look broader at the continent. Dzvinka, give us kind of your perspective on the paper that you're starting to put together and the research that you've done into this topic so we can get a lay of the land.
Thanks, Eric. I think how we get to the disinformation topic, it came from the research on the state capture that was happening during Zuma period in South Africa, where a number of institution purposes were laid and changed to benefit a few of the proxies to President Zuma. And one of the big issues was nuclear deal when the Russian President Putin has approached Zuma to build nuclear power stations. And by investigation and looking deeper into how that nuclear deal was happening, we came to the idea of disinformation, because even Zuma's period ended, and at the moment South Africa has a different president, Cyril Ramaphosa. The nuclear conversation continues, and certain narratives appeared that are strongly linked to promoting nuclear and that are not really true. And that's basically what we looked into with Jean, into how those narratives are promoted and what are the organizations that are promoting those narratives.
Jean, you mentioned, Dzvinka mentioned that proxies were used to plant narratives in the South African media. How did that actually work, and which kind of narratives were they promoting?
This was actually quite interesting. It was I first picked up on this not from the State Capture Commission, but from research that I was doing while still with News 24 as an investigative journalist. I noticed there was an organization that kind of just popped up out of nowhere, suddenly becoming very vocal on social media. This was around about the time that South Africa was kind of restructuring its integrated resource plan, which is our energy roadmap for the next couple of years. I think it's about 5 to 15 years ahead that the IRP actually plans South Africa's energy needs and the energy mix. And right about the time that this was being rediscussed and the composition of that renegotiated, this organization kind of popped up on social media, extremely vocal. They appeared to, be well resourced. They had presentations ready. They had graphics ready, and they kind of was quite adamant on pushing nuclear as the preferred energy generation model for South Africa. Now, this comes off of the back of a extremely controversial nuclear deal, as Dzvinka mentioned, where there were allegations that the president was involved, there were allegations that ministers were involved, and that there were backroom deals that were trying to push this nuclear deal through at an exorbitant cost. The deal was eventually stopped by the Constitutional Court, which found that a lot of the procedures and the checks and the balances for this procurement wasn't followed. This organization, came up there. They were extremely vocal in favor of nuclear, but at the same time, they were quite opaque in terms of their management. You couldn't see who's running the account. You couldn't see who are the directors, who are the shareholders, if any, who are the experts they referred to. And through a little bit of digging, we actually came across this organization and found proxies linking back to Russian state-owned energy corporations through some of the directors of this NGO as it started out.
John, very quickly, we've heard you guys both say state capture. I think that's an important concept that I'm not entirely clear on. Could you explain what state capture means?
Yeah, definitely. State captures in South Africa, it's pretty much commonplace. Or at least the term is used very commonplace. There's an entire commission of inquiry that was set up to investigate this phenomenon. And what it basically entails is the abuse of state machinery, whether it's state-owned corporations or, individual ministers in their portfolio positions, and where these organizations are being used for motives that would benefit certain individuals or certain families or certain non-state entities. The biggest example of this, as Dzvinka mentioned, is the Gupta family that's been accused of sitting behind quite a lot of these captured state organs where normal processes, normal contract and tendering processes were railroaded in order to make provision for these families to benefit.
Okay, so Cobus, taking into account what both John and Dzvinka have said in terms of state capture and the way that the Russians approached the nuclear deal in South Africa, bring us into how the Chinese communicate and if there are similarities and differences in what they've done.
Well, I think, and this I'd like to get Dzvinka's take on as well. For me, one of the mysteries of kind of Russian communication is that in Africa particularly is that in some cases, like in the South African case, they're clearly promoting, the interests of Russian parties, kind of be they kind of state-owned nuclear organizations, or in the case of Libya, for example, there's a whole raft of Russian misinformation pages on Facebook promoting Russian-backed actors in the Libyan civil war. So there you can see a kind of a direct link to Russia. But in other cases in Africa, they frequently, they seem almost like a kind of a wild card. Kind kind of sowing misinformation and kind of disrupting election processes where you don't really see very clear kind of Russian agenda. I think in the case of China, the agenda is relatively clear. In that it's kind of promoting a vision of China in the world, an idea of China in the world as a kind of a South development partner, and then any kind of like framing any kind of criticism of China as a Western plot. So in that sense, it's interesting. Like Russia seems to be kind of more all over the place. Dzvinka, am I getting that right? Like, how do you see the role of Russia in cases where there aren't particularly clear-cut Russian interests at play?
Yeah, I think there are different approaches that Russia is using depending on how politically aligned or disaligned is country to Russia. So if the country is aligned and there is direct political communication with the president and the government, it's one type of communication. Comparing to if the country is misaligned, then it's used a different approach. During the Soviet Union, in active measures, there was this classification of black, gray, and white active measures. And white active measure is open communication. So here we are talking about state media like Russia Today that is openly broadcasting around African countries and is relatively popular and promoting specific pro-Russian but also anti-Western narratives. There are a few other media communication channels that also openly speak on behalf of Russian value systems and Russian ideas. But if the country is not ideologically aligned, then even during Soviet Union period and Cold War, it was used more black active measures. And here we talk about proxy organizations that look African but are promoting specific ideas of Russia, and also about criticism and changing the perception of opinion leaders who are opposing Russian politics. So those are kind of the different ways of communication, and that's maybe also what causes perception that there is different approaches that Russia is using. I think there is a global agenda. There is a global agenda of UN and how different African countries that represent a significant portion of countries that are voting in the UN will be voting, especially because Russia is under Western sanctions, and that's why African countries are posing higher value and their perception and their representation in the UN system.
Let's talk about some of the different approaches that you mentioned, Dzvinka, and we'll kind of break down some of the Chinese approaches and then see if there, again, are some parallels with what the Russians are doing. One of the mistakes that I think a lot of people make when they look at the Chinese media engagement, for example, in Africa, is they look at just the what's above the surface. So they'll see CGTN, the TV network that's based out of Kenya, and they'll look at China Daily, even Global Times to some extent, some of their international editions. China Radio International is on a lot of terrestrial broadcasting outlets in many African countries. And so that they'll say is that's the main kind of forward-facing part of the propaganda. What people are not seeing is what's under the surface, and that the Chinese, particularly Xinhua, have done these distribution deals with a number of different African media sites. So Modern Ghana, for example, is one. Daily Nation in Kenya is another. And you'll see this throughout the African internet, where it's basically just the news feed that goes out. And it's much like AP and Reuters, it's just kind of all mixed in there. And so a lot of Chinese narratives will be put through into these big giant news feeds, and sometimes it says Xinhua and sometimes it doesn't. The other way that they're doing it is they have taken a stake in Independent Online, which is one of the big South African media companies. And one of the things that we've seen happen there is they will start to take Xinhua articles, change them a little bit, the same way that journalists would do this with AP or Reuters, change the topics a little bit, the subject material, and then put an African journalist's name on it. So it's effectively still a Xinhua article, but at the same time, it is masquerading with an African journalist's name. So it makes it even harder for people to figure out what's what. And then the last part of this is, of course, what we use the word state capture, but Cobus, you and I have talked about over the years about governing elites and China's relationship with governing elites, and they will make sure that they leverage their relationship with governing elites to ensure that their message points are conveyed. So we saw just a couple months ago in Uganda when one of the Ugandan state-owned newspapers did not properly characterize Taiwan in accordance with the One China policy. And boy, the embassy came down on the paper and they issued a retraction and a correction and whatnot. And so that's all guiding the narrative, not necessarily misinformation, but still part of it. John, with all of that in mind, do you see any similarities with what the Russians are doing based on what the Chinese are currently doing in Africa?
So just quickly a comment on that, Eric. The things you've mentioned now, we've as the DFRLab, we've conducted our own research into the COVID-related narratives and the COVID-related disinformation coming from China since the start of this year. And it was quite interesting when you mentioned about these articles being kind of syndicated through from the CGTN and the People's Daily and so on. One of the incidents that we picked up on was where Chinese disinformation targeting the US as the origin of the virus was circulated into publications in New Zealand and Helsinki, for example. And I mean, a lot of that you mentioned just now, we've actually seen evidence of that. It's part of research we've done that echoes a lot of that. In terms of the Russian parallels to that, it's not as prevalent or as clear as the Chinese examples. You've got the RT publications syndicating articles from South Africa. You've got these kind of pop-up television stations specifically circulate or orbiting the BRICS partnership that are cropping up. And I mean, a lot of these institutions, even though it might not necessarily be publishing disinformation or fake news, if you want to call it that, they are shaping the narrative and they are busy pushing certain agendas for Russia. Dzvinka does have a lot more on Afrique and these television stations. So Dzvinka, if you want to jump in, please feel free.
Yes, I just wanted to say that, when we talk about Russian disinformation, it's also very difficult to attribute some of those things. For example, during Zuma period in South Africa, there were also state-established news agency such as New Age newspaper or ANN TV channel. And those were paid with South African taxpayers' money and supported. So the division between corruption inside African countries and geopolitical influence is not very clear. We can see that the approach used is similar, but it can be used by South African authorities that were in power, not necessarily only by geopolitical influence. Where we can speak more confidently is, for example, when we talk about Afrique, which is non-governmental organizations established with the support of Russia to conduct observations during elections. And it was established around 2018, and at the moment we have enough data to say that that organization is supported from Russia. And the idea of organization was to provide information about elections, so to serve as organizations that observes election and provide the statements about whether elections were free or not, in line with Russian political influences. So this organization did not follow the code of conduct for international election observers. So the duration of the mission didn't have to be long enough to make the conclusion, and the number of people that are doing observations also wasn't controlled but this organization was used then by Russian state media to promote certain narratives about free elections in Zimbabwe or other countries. Similar mission was conducted also to South Africa, where it was announced that 300 poll stations were observed, where in practice there were only 7. So you make those statements, creating information where you don't really have the ground for it.
One of the biggest issues, I think, or one of the biggest differences between China and Russian approaches is the mix of media. So both of you have mentioned, TV and print. But I was wondering about the role of social media. On the Chinese side, obviously within China, there are these billion strong troll armies. But so far, China has been a relatively slow kind of adapter of Western social media platforms like Twitter. I mean, we're seeing now that Chinese ambassadors are starting to become a lot stronger on Twitter than they used to be. How is the use of social media different, or what is the particular role of social media on the Russian side of this, particularly in Africa?
I think with confidence we can speak about the report that was done by Stanford Internet Observatory, Shelby Grossman with colleagues, where they explored network of era-related web pages and pages supporting that belong to specific political parties and are connected to Russian era organization. And those networks were in the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Madagascar, Mozambique, Sudan. So these were Facebook pages that were funded with the support. We also could remember that in March this year, there were Russian troll factories identified in African countries that were working on American elections, promoting specific messages in America while being residents in African countries. Also, we have a few documents leaked by Dossier Center about how Russia approaches disinformation in Africa, and it's strongly connected to the narratives promoted in the US. So while there is a specific approach to Africa, it's in the same document where you speak about the strategy to Africa and how the black issues could be promoted in the US. But Jean, maybe you can speak even more about the Twitter campaigns, because now in South Africa there is very active Twitter campaign specifically around energy, where you try to promote the narrative that nuclear is good. Nuclear brings transformation to South Africa and will benefit poor people in South Africa. So because South Africa has such a strong diversity between rich and poor people. So this narrative is easily used to say that nuclear energy is the only energy technology that will bring transformation to South Africa, comparing to renewable energy that will benefit Western countries.
Yeah, it's been kind of a consistent feature of Russian social media disinformation that, they play both sides of any divisive topic, whether it's based on race or class, income, poverty lines. They basically find a divisive topic and then play both sides of the field. That happened in the 2016 elections in the US, where they were playing left, the liberal individuals. They were doing the same thing on the conservative side. They used divisive topics such as gun control, the right to have an abortion, any topic that's got any kind of way to divide a population. They kind of target that. And that was what was seen earlier this year in the troll farms. That I know CNN did quite an expansive reporting on it, where they actually went into Ghana and they found the house where this troll farm was being operated from. And this was several Ghanaians, all of them well-meaning, normal citizens. They were being handled, if you want to call it that, by an individual with links back to Russia. And they were basically posting as US African Americans, pushing things about police violence, using these societal wedges to try and divide topics. So that same kind of playbook can be seen, or hints of that can be seen in the way that, for example, this organization that I spoke of earlier, the SAEF, which is short for the South African Energy Forum, the way they approach these topics, they use poverty and racial lines as a way to say, well, nuclear is the only option that will benefit Black South Africans. And they will say that, the renewable energy is something that's only going to be benefiting white Westerners and so on. So a lot of that kind of takes from the same playbook. The way that they approach it is very similar. There's, even though there's no, obviously from our research, we can't say, well, here are the receipts, here are the transactions that definitely prove it's instructions are coming from Russia. But if you look at their behavior and the way that they operate, the things that they do, the way that it and other organizations linked to it are structured, you can see that same silhouette being sketched, as Dzvinka mentioned, and as we've seen in other Russian-linked disinformation operations.
So you have focused most of your discussion in your research on Russian disinformation. We've talked about China and their propaganda. Again, it's a fine line between state propaganda and active disinformation. That's subject to interpretation to some extent. Are you finding that are other countries, is the US, Germany, France, are other countries also involved in this, or is it primarily the Russians and the Chinese who do this kind of propaganda and disinformation? John, let's go to you first, and then Dzvinka, I'd like to get your take on it.
Yeah, other countries are definitely playing as well. I think China and Russia get a lot of the attention, especially Russia because of the going-ons in the 2016 elections, and just the way that the kind of the US, Russia, and Europe relations tend to dominate the news cycles. A lot of those Northern Hemisphere countries do get a lot of the media attention around these kind of topics. Well, in the meantime, other entities at the DFRLab, we've tracked disinformation operations running in Brazil. We found them in India. We found them in Iran. All of them kind of tailored to their unique situation. Some of the more interesting things we found is, disinformation operations being orchestrated from Egypt, for example, targeting various other North African countries. So you've actually got that intra-African kind of disinformation operations using PR agencies as proxies. So there's definitely a lot going on, from various nation states, and not necessarily just Russia, China, and the usual suspects.
Yeah, so I think obviously different countries are trying to promote their agenda, but everybody's trying to use different mechanisms, and we can see that Russia has a specific narrative to promote, and Africa plays quite an important role, especially because of the sanctions that the Western countries apply to Russia, which limits their activities and opportunities in many other countries. But I also wanted to change a little bit of a conversation to the topic of resilience, because we should understand that disinformation campaigns, this is a not new event. This has been going on for over 100 years. Different countries were promoting, and we do have examples of US-based or European-based campaigns to promote certain narratives. At the same time, in the interest of African countries is to build resilience to those situations that African countries can promote their own agenda and not to be swayed by different countries. And maybe also another point, that depending whether a country is democratic or more authoritarian, the disinformation would play a different role, because we also can observe that in African countries, similar to other countries around the world, the internet can be controlled. And if we talk about social media disinformation campaigns, if it's controlled by the government, if internet can be shut down for a certain period of time, then it obviously going to affect how disinformation is presented in each of those countries.
Jean, so we've seen rising kind of awareness and dismay and panic about the role of disinformation campaigns in many different countries. It's getting a lot of attention in the US around the coming election, but there's a lot of discussion around this in Africa too. But we're not really seeing a lot of discussion about what might counter it. Do you have any idea of what is the kind of weaknesses of these campaigns? Like how can they be kind of disarmed? Is there any way?
That's kind of the holy grail of disinformation is research. Is how do you stop it? How do you inoculate the population against it? And there's various schools of thought. On the one hand, proponents are saying that you need to put more good information out there. Kind of drown out the bad info and the disinformation and the misinformation with good, proper information. Others are saying, well, you need to actively investigate, find these people, and then expose them. Personally, I feel that a mix between these two are probably best. We are staying or living in an era where our attention is being vied for various different resources. So just putting more information out there kind of introduces almost an apathy in people. So you tend to go for the easiest narrative, the one that's the most easy to understand and easy to digest. And unfortunately, that's usually the disinformation narratives. At the same time, it takes a lot of resources to debunk and investigate these disinformation campaigns. There's a lot of data involved, there's research involved, findings need to be proofed and checked and double-checked and triple-checked before you can make findings. And even then, it's always it's difficult to then attribute a specific campaign to one particular entity or even a nation state. So a combination of that is probably the best way. I think people are a lot more aware than they were 2 or 3 years ago. In South Africa, we had our own little run-in with the so-called Gupta bots, which was a disinformation campaign orchestrated on the same Gupta family that was responsible for the state capture. And I can definitely see from what I've seen following that, people are a lot more aware that there are these fake social media accounts. There are entities larger than the 1 or 2 people that follow you on Facebook or Twitter that are trying to use those systems to influence opinions and influence behaviors.
Dzvinka, very last question to you. John gave us some ideas on how to prepare for this. What would be your advice as somebody who's looking into this for the average media consumer in Africa or elsewhere to arm themselves and defend themselves against this kind of misinformation?
If you look at what disinformation is trying to do, they are promoting polarization. So obviously those countries where equality is higher are more stronger and more resilient to disinformation. So as citizens, we should promote more accountability from the government to reduce those polarization, to reduce the corruption, and this would result into a stronger, more resilient country to disinformation. Also to improve critical thinking, and as Jean has mentioned, by just putting true information does not convince consumers of disinformation and propaganda. You almost have to explain how the information was manipulated and how it's benefiting specific narratives. But even by explaining all the connections, it's still really difficult to prevent from something like that happening again. So by promoting critical thinking and exposing our internal biases, we can improve our resilience to disinformation. Another important factor is media and independence of media, and how the society, how much the society trusts to media. And here, if countries have media that not really independent or that are promoting very specific narratives, it creates problems of distrust. And then even if you have certain media that remain independent, the distrust will cover all different media resources. So population will not be trusting journalists. So supporting independence of media is another important factor. And I think also what we can see that social media platforms are increasing regulation by themselves. There are more and more support to independent media, social media monitoring and fact-checking organization. In South Africa, there is a platform, Real 411, where anybody can log a complaint about disinformation, and independent expert will provide their view whether the information is true or false. Similar, Africa Check, another organization that is actively promoting resisting misinformation and detecting false narratives.
And we also want to give a shout out to the team at AFP Fact Check in Nigeria, who also does something very similar to debunk fake news, misleading news, and incomplete news. Dzvinka Kachur is a researcher at the Center for Complex Systems and Transitions at Stellenbosch University in beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. Jean Le Roux is a research associate with the Digital Forensic Research Lab, a department within the Atlantic Council think tank in Washington. He too is also in Cape Town. Thank you both for sharing your research with us. And we're really looking forward to when your paper comes out. We'd love to have you come back to talk about your findings. And again, thank you for your time today.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Eric.
Cobus, I am thoroughly depressed after listening to what they said, because there really is no way for the average person to defend themselves against this. I mean, it's so much information. How do you know where one thing comes from or one thing isn't? Again, we talked about in the Chinese context, they're using lots of different ways to disseminate their news and information. Again, they would take issue with the concept of disinformation. From what we know from the reporting, they do engage in active disinformation campaigns in the United States, in Australia, and other kind of larger kind of core strategic interests. We haven't seen evidence of that in Africa. What they are doing in Africa is probably more along the lines of propaganda. But propaganda and disinformation do kind of fall into a very gray, murky area. And then the other part of this that we didn't talk about is just terrible journalism and bad reporting. This came up last week quite a bit when the United States Department of Defense, a couple weeks ago, issued their annual report on Chinese military activities around the world. Okay? And in that, there was one line that said, China has likely considered military bases, and they listed 12 countries, including Namibia and Kenya. Holy cow. That then sparked the Kenyan media, and we're talking most major news outlets in Kenya, went and said, China is considering having a base in Kenya. That then escalated to China is looking to have a base in Kenya, China's planning, and it just went up all the way up to China's going to open a U.S. base, a military base in Kenya. And now that started in Namibia as well, something to that effect. And that's just bad journalism, because there was no reference in that report. And they sourced back to the Pentagon report as their attribution for this. And it never said that in the report. And my point here is that mix bad journalism in with disinformation, with social media, and you get a toxic brew that is just really, really hard to figure out what's what.
Yeah, it's really difficult. It's very difficult to disentangle, and one of the problems that compounds this is that it isn't really possible to locate disinformation campaigns in one particular place. It is obviously very fashionable to blame Russia and China for good reasons, and in many cases. But for example, the state captured disinformation that Dzvinka mentioned, which were frequently kind of Russia-focused messaging, was disseminated in South Africa by Bell Pottinger, a British public relations firm. So, kind of this is the way that in previous conversations we've we focused on surveillance, Chinese surveillance in Africa, and then we had to like continually say yes, and also Italian and British and American firms. And this is the same situation, kind of like disinformation is a kind of a free for all, I think, at the moment, and I think just simply blaming one country for it, no matter how problematic they are, is this kind of misreading the situation.
And so part of the cure is good journalism. And that's what motivates us in some ways, is to be able to do this kind of work that we're doing on the website and the podcast and whatnot, and to be a source of good information. Again, Africa Check is another amazing resource. AFP Fact Checked is great. The Daily Maverick, Daily Nation, Premium Times in Nigeria. These are all amazing African media outlets, and I think supporting them is going to be a very, very important antidote to some of this. The problem is, Cobus, though, is that sounds great. We all want to have great, high-quality media, but they're getting killed in the advertising market. And media brands around the world, great journalism brands around the world, especially in Africa, are under enormous financial pressure in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that advertising has just fallen off a cliff, plus the fact that Facebook and Google is gobbling up a vast majority of advertising revenue. That also presents a challenge in challenging and in really questioning a lot of the fake news and pushing people away from relying on unknown, unsourced Twitter and Facebook feeds for information rather than outlets like Daily Maverick and others that really do provide wonderful, good, high-quality journalism. So the future, unfortunately, does not look very promising in this space.
Well, this is one of the reasons why we started initiatives like our daily newsletter, which is, it's essentially taking a deep niche like China-Africa issues and really covering it, kind of in a lot of detail, trying to maximize all of the different kind of voices one features. But, that's a very dedicated effort, as we know. And it's also only for a relatively kind of niche audience, particularly an audience that's willing to pay for it, which is a tall order for many people in Africa. So that also, it's not really a kind of a cure-all.
No, it's not going to be a cure-all. Let's hope that foundations come through and other alternative ways of financing journalism do come through, because that, to me, again, it's something near and dear to my heart as a journalist for 30 years, that we continue to invest in good quality storytelling that is informed and well balanced. But it is very difficult right now. And as somebody who used to run media networks in both the US, Europe, and in Asia, I've been out on the sales calls, and people will tell you right up to your face, I'm not going to put money into your media brand because I put it all into Facebook and Google. And there you go. And so that results in you having to lay off journalists and not invest in the kind of reporting that challenges this kind of misinformation. So as Cobus said, we spend all day putting this together. So if you are interested in the China-Africa space in particular, it's super easy to get started with us. Just $3 for 3 months will get you our daily email newsletter. It also gives you access to all the information on our website, plus our China-Africa Experts Network, which is now at about 120, 130 folks, mostly young African and Chinese experts that if you are doing research, or you are a think tank analyst or a journalist, and you want to diversify your sourcing to get people who are from underrepresented communities, this is a great resource for you to do that. The subscription, again, just $3 for 3 months, and then it's only $7 for students after that, or teachers every month, or $15 a month for everybody else. Go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. Give us a try. And again, if you have any questions, you can email us directly, Eric@ChinaAfricaProject.com, or Cobus at ChinaAfricaProject.com. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. Cobus and I are back every week with a new episode, most weeks 2 episodes, and we'll be back again next week with another show. Until then, thank you so much for listening. For Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thanks a lot.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.